Mike, there's a bit of breaking news. The State Department is set to review all 55 million people with U.S. visas for, quote, deportable violations. That seems like a rather large undertaking for the State Department, but I know you have been highlighting a lot of the initiatives that they've been doing. I'd love to just get your sort of reaction to that, but also what you've been really hammering where they need to press, particularly on the USAID files.
The State Department has been very aggressive under Secretary Rubio on a whole range of initiatives. Obviously, there was the mass firing of about 4,000 employees last month. There was the shutdown of the Censorship Center, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department. There is a giant reorganization where about 130 different sub-bureaus are being zapped out. And now there's the announcement of this giant undertaking. Obviously, 55 million people is about a sixth of the entire U.S. population, and sort of speaks to the sheer size of how much this country has ingested over the course of our lifetime. We'll see how much of that actually ends up being administered or reviewed. Ironically, the State Department may have to hire a whole new flood of people to carry out that kind of investigation, but that would be a good opportunity for the Trump administration to staff the State Department with folks who are ideologically on sides with the foreign policy vision of the MAGA movement. Adjacent to that is the building right next to the State Department, which is the U.S. Institute of Peace, which gets about $55 million a year from the U.S. taxpayers, that has just been toppled. It's a legal transition, but the U.S. Institute of Peace, which is a very almost 1984 named institution, it's just like in 1984 there was the Ministry of Peace that conducted war. The U.S. Institute of Peace is very much a war front. Its wall of donors, I was just in the building last week, its wall of donors are Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, a bunch of oil companies like Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell. It is a mandatory board seat for the Secretary of War, as well as the President of the National Defense University. It's sort of war under the name of peace. But effectively, what the U.S. Institute of Peace has been doing has been promoting illegal narcotics and the production of them. The U.S. Institute of Peace put out a memo in 2023 to the Taliban instructing them to keep the drugs flowing in Afghanistan. That was, of course, very useful to the Biden administration because that drug money paid the ISIS fighters, effectively funded the insurgency, al-Qaeda and ISIS forces, who the following year would topple Bashar al-Assad and install a new government run by a former ISIS al-Qaeda leader, Mohammed al-Jilani, who previously had a $10 million bounty on his head under the Trump administration, but under the Biden administration, they made him the king of Syria. And this is, again, sort of run out of the auspices of this State Department-adjacent U.S. Institute of Peace. The U.S. Institute of Peace also ran a global campaign for internet censorship, working to try to get judges and legislatures to ban hate speech or ban mis and disinformation. They had a strategy that included going to the electoral management bodies, that is the courts that decide elections, to get them to say that speech about the election should be considered part of the judicial jurisdiction so that judges can censor speech, the same way we saw happen in Brazil, where the judge, Moraes, the head of the EMB, the electoral management body in Brazil, did the same thing. So we see this as part of a government strategy under the Biden administration. The U.S. Institute of Peace actually has whole training seminars on how to organize riots, how to occupy government buildings, how to block city intersections and block roads, how to blockade train tracks to prevent cargo from going from place to place when you're protesting something. And even called in its instructions for the sponsored protest movements of it to deliberately seek to get arrested so that USAID-sponsored media can hold up the arrested figures as being martyrs for the cause and can justify economic sanctions. So we have this real blob apparatus. The U.S. Institute of Peace fought the mandatory turnover tooth and nail. Guns were discovered in the building. They knocked the bolts out of the doors. There had to be a showdown with federal police. They tried to delete a terabyte of financial data, which fortunately was recovered by Doge. But there is one big missing piece in all of this, which is the transparency about the files themselves from so much of this legacy behavior. And I can talk about that now with things like the USAID files and State Department files, but I'll pause there if you have any questions about what I just said.
No, keep going. But I'm curious if you can sort of put us inside the U.S. Institute of Peace, what you saw there when you were touring it with, I don't know if Dr., or I guess he's a new title now, but Director Darren J. Beatty was with you, but what his sort of vision looks like for that institute.
Well, I think Darren's vision is to build it from the ground up and to do it in a way that restores trust without the diplomacy through duplicity that the U.S. Institute of Peace was known for. The fact is the building is basically the territory of George Bush, Bill Clinton, Madeleine Albright. These are the figures that the wings of the building are named after. And it's kind of the Confederacy of dunces when you sort of Trump's surrounded by all of his enemies on the wall, everyone who tried to defeat him through lawfare, indictments, and CIA black ops are the figures who adorn the quite beautiful walls of the building. I think it is the most stunning building in Washington, D.C. It must have been a lot of fun to work there, especially when you had the godlike powers these people were bestowed. I'm sure they had quite a thrill ride. But the fact is that thrill ride is now over, and it's accountability time. I think Darren's vision is likely to involve leveraging the legacy network that the institution has built up, but making it conform to the foreign policy vision of the State Department. Darren is also presently the Undersecretary of Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and these are very similar functions, given that the U.S. Institute of Peace is effectively an adjunct of the State Department. But what's critical to all of this is a disclosure in order to have trust with other countries around the world, and in order to give a full accounting to the American people of how their tax dollars were spent. These files have to be made public. For example, the U.S. Institute of Peace is a program called the Program on Nonviolent Action. Now, nonviolent is a code for mob violence. I don't need to tell you, Natalie, that I'm speaking to you nonviolently. If I need to put that in the name, something is up. And in fact, it is up at the U.S. Institute of Peace. They openly promote property destruction as part of the tactics of the so-called nonviolent mob, because they say that property destruction does not count as violence because we only define violence as bodily harm. So you can set police cars on fire, you can burn down police precincts, you can destroy the parliament building, as they've done in countries like Serbia and the like, and Ukraine, and that still counts as, quote, nonviolent action. But I believe that every document that the Program on Nonviolent Action has ever internally produced should be made publicly available to the U.S. taxpayers who paid for it. Every single person who worked there was paid by U.S. taxpayers. We have a right to know all of the domestic touch points, because the U.S. Institute of Peace is supposed to point outward. Even the dirty deeds they do, the CIA work they do, and the CIA moves through them, they're an asset, essentially, that they create a network of assets for the CIA to play with abroad. So when you see these color revolutions break out in Georgia or the Czech Republic or Ukraine or Syria or Libya, they had that hand in that, but it was that exact same network that set about organizing the riots that we have seen in this country for the past 10 years. Maria Stephan, the person who ran the Program on Nonviolent Action, deliberately points to the U.S. as the source of the same democratic violations that she cites internationally. Her work explicitly covers now the domestic affairs. She had an organizing role in countless riots from the protests and riots of the past 8 years. And given that she's leveraging this same taxpayer-funded network, I believe all of those files need to be made public, even if it is an embarrassment at a certain diplomatic level that other countries get to see what the U.S. planned. This is how we get trust back, by saying this is not how we do business anymore. And I believe that's also going to lead to levels of accountability with how to reform these institutions once the network set is fully laid out. And on that note, I have to mention that the USAID files are absolutely key to this. If there's one thing that the CIA, the State Department, and the U.S. Institute of Peace all have in common, and that's USAID. USAID was the great front for 60 years for this whole network. And USAID formally shut down on July 1st. That's almost 2 months ago now. It's been absorbed by the F branch of the State Department, the Foreign Assistance branch of the State Department. So they are now administering the legacy grants. It's about 30%-ish of the USAID function. There have been 14,000 people who were laid off at USAID, and it's being administered by a much smaller crew of people. But we need to see the USAID files, the internal analyst memos, the white papers, the emails, the text messages, everything from USAID employee to USAID employee or USAID employee to NGO or contractor has to be made public. And I can give you some great examples of why this is such a necessity. But the present blocking point, as I understand it, is that the State Department does not presently even have access to the USAID files because of the IT blockages. That is, USAID people, I believe, simply didn't turn over the encryption or the passwords or the like. So we're sitting on the Library of Alexandria of historical knowledge of what the Biden administration and the blob have been doing, and nobody's even opened the door yet. I find that shocking.
I want to sort of piece this together, right, which is the deep state, the permanent political class, the in-your-face state, however you want to couch it. Frankly, in this paradigm, I think maybe just likening it more to the kind of ossified career civil servant mentality in a lot of these departments or agencies, institutions, take your pick, but how they cover up the actions of a lot of these very rogue politicals. So my question is, why haven't these USAID files that you were talking about, why haven't they been released? What is the holdup there?
Well, my understanding is that it's a technical issue that, when you're talking about documents that are stored in a digitized way, there's encryption, there's passwords, there's access codes, and remember, USAID fought tooth and nail to the very last courtroom they could humanly litigate in order to stave off the Trump administration. USAID was shut down, actually not primarily for its bad behavior, but because it refused to turn over documents. It was really the only agency in the federal government that just straight up refused to allow the new administration. It's a U.S. government agency under the executive branch, and it just refused to give the executive branch the documents, the emails, any of that. And while we still have, the State Department is still administering the grants, all of the legacy information, for example, the USAID has a country office in every country, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, or whether it's in Central or South America. Every country has a mission. There's email traffic and files and analyst papers and classified documents in all of those countries. There's also the bureaus within USAID. For example, probably the worst of them was the bureau called DRG within USAID. That's Democracy, Rights, and Governance. That was for the democracy promotion, the regime change, and paying the media, and paying the unions, and paying the NGOs, and governance, which is effectively when USAID has programs to take control over elements of your government. And the DRG branch of USAID is who ran the censorship syndicate that was funded to the tune of billions of dollars over the past 8 years by USAID. All of the traffic between the NGOs and USAID, because every grant recipient from USAID had to file reports, had to file annual reports, had to do quarterly updates, had to correspond with their grant administrator about how they were fulfilling their milestones. Most of these grants are for absolutely atrocious things, and nothing that USAID did was honest. It's always dual purpose. It's always some nominal thing that it says it does, and then some CIA covert sub-purpose. That's the only reason to run it through USAID as opposed to the State Department. But you can't understand the history of these countries and what you're inheriting at the State Department unless you have the USAID side of the story. And I'll give you an example. Earlier this month, I testified for about 6 hours in front of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Brazilian Senate. And I went over for about 5.5 of those hours how USAID built the censorship syndicate within Brazil, how it funded dozens of censorship organizations, how it worked directly with the Brazilian court in order to get the judges to combat disinformation, so to speak, to take down posts, to throttle narratives, to rule things as illegal to say in Brazil. Now, all of this will be in what I have is 5.5 hours worth of open source information, things that at the time I culled from grants, I culled from the work of USAID-sponsored entities. But the real guts of this are ultimately going to lie in the USAID communications themselves. Donald Trump and Secretary Rubio are locked in horns right now with the country of Brazil. Brazil has gone full China. They've divested from many American contracts and given China control over their agriculture, their energy, their IT. There's currently sanctions on Brazil's chief justice of their election court, and Brazil is now trying to defy those sanctions by ordering their banks not to honor the American sanctions policy, which if that goes through could upend hundreds of different sanctions regimes that the U.S. has in place. And the State Department does not even understand what they've inherited because they don't have the USAID side of the story. The USAID mission in Brazil, all those files from the past 8 years have to be made available, have to be made public. They at least have to be reviewed by the State Department. But we have more transparency into the CIA than we do USAID. In theory, Tulsi can ask for and declassify any CIA document, but neither Tulsi at ODNI nor the State Department can even get into the USAID files. They need an IT expert in there immediately to decrypt this and make it public.
Are you available? I think that's what the audience is asking. Mike, we've got to bounce. Obviously, we'll have you back on soon. In the meantime, though, where can people go to follow you and stay up to date with all your wonderful work?
Follow me on X at Mike Ben Cyber, also on YouTube and Rumble.